Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much again for returning for this class. I'm so excited to kind of continue our conversation about self-actualization in the age of crisis. So a quick recap, right? Last week we spent most of our time discussing the age of crisis, or the meta-crisis, the poly-crisis as it's often referred to. Essentially the various crises that you combine into a web of an existential threat to kind of the nature of being and kind of where we are. Much of which I argued is tied to the creations that we've kind of surrounded ourselves with. So many of the things are not our doing, many of them are. I discussed the meta-crisis from 6 distinct perspectives, which was the crisis of extinction, our environmental crisis of the billionaire God King, which is our structural, legal, and economic institutions, the crisis of information, truth, and trust, especially in the age of AI, how it's very difficult anymore to kind of tell what is real and what is not real, the crisis of elective misrepresentation, the idea that democracies around the world, but especially in the US, exist under corporate capture. There's not really a lot of imagination in our political system, and the institutions kind of seek to preserve themselves. And the crisis of productivity and participation, the idea that an increasing number of people are left out of the capacity to participate in society, and that's going to have significant consequences if the trend continues. The idea that disruption is not necessarily a bad thing, but that we have no institutions to kind of help people redirect their lives generates a serious crisis, and especially in the next probably decade or two with AI. And then finally, the crisis of doubt, desire, death, and dogmas, which is a crisis of spirituality. Essentially, I argue that the inherited narratives of spirituality that we've kind of have based on history fail to meet the needs of the moment. And I want to emphasize again, as we kind of dive into today's conversation, Time and Divinity of the Moment, is going to dive into the physics and cosmology behind the grounding of the revised spiritual project, the grounding of a spiritual alternative, what I like to title the non-religion religion. I want to emphasize again in the very beginning that although at times I'm critical of some of the structures, I want to emphasize my critiques are more about the structures, nothing about the people who believe in or participate in within the institutions, right? I think our greatest crisis of all the ones I've mentioned is not that we're here, but that we've lacked alternatives. So today, and over the next this course and the next 2 after this, we're going to dive deep into alternatives. How can we imagine more? How can we imagine an alternative vision of humanity, and how can we kind of use that to kind of transcend the crises? So let's dive in. Our agenda today is we're going to talk about, we have 6 things we're going to speak about, and then we'll open up the discussion. The first is exponential growth. The second is the universe has a story, or the universe has a history. And we'll dive into the cosmology and physics. The fourth is the changing nature of time. The fifth will be the single truth. The sixth is oneness with the relational universe. The seventh is birth lottery and event chains, and I'll open it up into open discussion. So again, the idea today is really kind of grounding, how do we imagine an alternative given the knowledge we presently have? And I think that's the key thing, is everything I'm going to talk about today, and obviously I'm going to talk about it, but I want to emphasize again, the book, which is available online for free, or you can get physical copies, has all of our sources, all of the journals, all the academic papers in it that you can research yourself to kind of further these things. So I'm going to dive a bit into exponential growth. This is where we'll start. And I'm going to keep this will probably be our least topic. I know many of you have academic backgrounds, so I don't want to reiterate too much, but I want to emphasize exponential growth, essentially, this is very top, is like when a unit of measure grows by its present value, or it doubles in the time that you're measuring it. And this chart, what you're seeing on this chart is essentially what exponential growth looks like over time. In our last discussion, we briefly talked about the idea of thinking about conceptualizations linearly. Linearly is that line, right? It increases by a set amount each time, and exponentially, where over time exponential growth kind of reaches this curve where it kind of enters essentially a huge bell curve, becomes very steep, and progress goes pretty rapid in a variety of directions. Exponential growth is occurring everywhere. Okay, we see exponential growth in trends. The most obvious one is technology and technological advancement. We are presently in an exponential growth of our technological progress, which is only being compounded by the development of AI and self-learning machines. We now have algorithms that can learn. And these algorithms, not only can they learn, but they can predict. And one of the most fascinating things about AI is there is emergent properties to it. That is to say that you can train an AI model to do a thing. And through that training, it will not only do the thing that you programmed it to, but it will also create new pathways. And that's the emergent property of self-learning machines. That's why towards the end of our class, we talked a bit about context, like the context of history. And what I want to emphasize is, while that is relevant and important, there is no context for the moment we inhabit today. There's no context in history for self-learning machines and what they are doing to the nature of society, both in our projective agendas, our imaginative agendas, etc. Now we see technology is the most obvious one, right? And that's also, if you're familiar with like the venture capital world, that's at any startup, that's what they want you to do. They invest money and they want you to exponentially grow your revenue. That's how they track progress, right? But it's also, we see exponential growth in things like population growth, the spread of pandemics. There's a great book by Ray Kurzweil called The Singularity is Near, and he actually tracks exponential growth to the biological evolution of life on Earth. So here's one little fascinating tidbit. Single-cell organisms took about 3 million years to go from a single-cell organism to a multicellular organism. So 3 million years. And then it took about 1.5 million years to go from multicellular organisms to more complex organisms. And he tracks that over time. So there's exponential growth is really fascinating, is that it seems to be, as we kind of learn more and more, a property of the universe, which in fact is actually expanding exponentially itself. And that is one of the, I want to kind of hit on that a bit, because that's one of the really fascinating observations when we talk about the breakdown of like static principles, static thought, the idea that the universe is expanding. Our previous vision of physics was that physics was immutable in many ways, right? Physics has yet to fail in experimental tests, like quantum physics is the same thing. So the idea that the universe is expanding, that the acceleration of that expansion is increasing, defies the known laws of physics, at least what we used to believe about physics. We believe they were immutable. So the idea being is that as stellar bodies get farther away from the initial singularity, the Big Bang, if you like, the expansion, they should be slowing down because that momentum loses over time and there's less initial kind of force behind it. But they're in fact speeding up. So when we talk about the nature of exponential growth, I think what I really want to kind of hit on is that what we have all inherited is a history of linear growth and linear thought process. Now, that's not to say that exponential growth hasn't been happening. It's always been happening. The problem is, as human beings, we have a limited lifespan, right? If we're living to 50 to 100 years old on average, in the context of collective evolution of the universe, that's a very small, it's a blip, right? And so it's very easy for us to lose sight of our progress. And in as recently, let's say, as probably the last like 50 years, I mean, life felt slow. Life was much slower. The kind of explosions of progress were limited. They were kind of industry specific, and yes, they happened, but then you kind of go through the same routine. We can go farther back, right? For most of humans' existence, outside of, let's say, 200,000 years, let's say we've probably spent 190,000 of that like hunting and gathering, right, foraging, and then the last 10,000, 12,000 years of kind of civilization as we presently understand it, of agricultural civilization. Sustenance farming was a very linear life. You got up, you did your thing, you farmed your food, and you repeated that cycle. It's also very difficult because, to that note, right, the very nature of being human, we need sleep. Right? Sleep is in many ways kind of a reset. It makes it very difficult. Like every day is like a new day, and you kind of do the same thing in many different ways. And obviously we do different things, but for the most part, you make incremental change. And I think what I'm trying to hit upon here is that as human beings, our capacity to create change within a moment is incremental. Okay, we can only do so much within our given moments, and we only have so many moments within a day. But that does not apply to our creations. They can create exponentially within a moment. So they're much more powerful than us. Again, I'll use the most prominent example is like AI, right? And there's a concept with computers called parallelism. So parallelism is essentially the capacity to do multiple operations at once. So many of you may relate to this, right? But I find it very difficult to multitask, right? I find it very important to focus on one thing at a time, get that thing done, and move on to the next thing. Because I find if I'm trying to do 5 things at once, it's very difficult. The human brain is not designed to multitask effectively. Computers are, right? That's what they do. They can run all of these processes at the same moment. That's what makes them powerful. So when we think about the nature of exponential growth, we understand that in the context of the crises that we inherit and kind of where we are, our trajectory, the path of least resistance, is kind of towards the increasing of the crisis, right? It's the crisis of extinction. All these things are getting worse because we're just doing the same thing. My argument is that linear thought process, linear imagination, is not going to solve the problems that we have in the immediate present. It's not going to help us kind of transcend the various crises. We need to orient ourselves with the nature of reality as it is, as opposed to what our perceptions kind of tell us that they want it to be in many ways. So we have to kind of apply a theory of exponential growth to our imagination of the possible. And that's how we kind of ground that. Let's move on. We're going to talk about the universe having a story. So the universe having a story, is I'm going to dive into the high level kind of cosmology and physics. But before I do that, I'll start with a statement. So one thing we want to begin from the start is to recognize that time, let's talk about time for a moment. Time is real. Sometimes people think that there's arguments being made that time is a construct. It's not at all accurate. Time is real, but it is not a product of the physical universe. So what I mean by that is time, as we experience it, did not emerge from the Big Bang. The history of the universe, all events in the history of the universe imply change. Right? Everything we can observe applies change within a moment. And for change to occur within a moment, time must be real. So when we kind of get to the history of the universe, there is, you may have heard, if it's of interest, it's often called the crisis of cosmology. Essentially in the last decade, the immutable laws of physics and all that we've kind of, the science that we've based around, in many ways the law and economics, right? I think much of the law and economics is based around Newtonian physics, has kind of come down because we've started to have observations where what we thought were immutable laws have broken down. So let's go to this image real quick. This is essentially a visualization of the expansion of the universe. That quantum fluctuations represents what we would otherwise call the singularity, the initial moment of reality that emerged, right? The universe itself. And since then, it's kind of expanded over time. Now, in that white area, it says inflation. That is referred to as the Planck epoch. Now, what happens in the Planck epoch is all of our known laws of physics break down. So mathematically, gravity breaks down, the strong and weak nuclear forces break down. The things that we have justified and kind of based our hard sciences on for decades stop working. And this has caused a really fundamental shift in the cosmology and physics community. What we understand about that inflationary moment today is that the universe existed as a superheated, unified whole. So the universe was one thing. It wasn't separate objects like it is today. Now, technically, we believe this, our theories and calculations believe this lasted for what we would call picoseconds, right? The smallest amount of measurement we can essentially track on a time scale. But still, we recognize that at one point, the universe was a superheated, unified whole where the laws of nature as we presently understand them, as they presently apply to us, did not exist in the shape they do today. What happened is, as the universe began to cool, the particles began to separate. And that's where the laws that over time, as the universe began to cool, the laws of physics as we presently understand them, as they presently govern our relationships with the world, began to take shape. Now, why this is called a crisis is because we, for, again, a long time believed that there were immutable laws of the universe. Immutable meaning that things, they don't change, right? So we believe that there were aspects of our universe that did not change. Now we understand that everything we've ever known has evolved, has changed over time. And that prevents a fundamental crisis for an institution and a philosophy of science that's based on static principles, right? Nothing about the universe has ever been static. Now, this is a heat map of the universe. This is the radiation that we can see of the universe from our unique coordinates on Earth. So this is what we can see of the universe. This is what we call the cosmic microwave background, and what you're looking at is a radiation map. Right? And so I believe it was 2018, a group of physicists published a paper identifying, and that's what this little circle is in the bottom right-hand corner, identifying an area, I think this thing? Oh, cool. Yeah. Can you see where I'm pointing? It's this little corner. So what they've identified there is they identified a patch of radiation that was older than the universe. Since then, another group of physicists, I believe they're based out of Russia, has confirmed this finding. What this means, well, first, how do we conceptualize this, right? First, if there's radiation that's older than our universe, that gives us a paradox, right? Like, well, how could that possibly be? Now, the first is that we can say, okay, well, possibly our calculations of the universe are wrong, and that is a possible reality. The one challenge to that is the physics community at large has formed consensus around the age of the universe, about 13.8 billion years. The other alternative is for this to exist, it must mean that there was something prior to this universe. How could something older than the universe be observed if something didn't exist prior to our universe? Now this is argued by, for example, the physicist Lee Smolin, physicist Roger Penrose. These are the individuals behind this kind of theory of this sequential universes. So essentially what we realize is that we inhabit one of many sequential universes. Now I want to make a clarifying point. You may have heard of the idea of like multiverse theory. Multiverse theory is that there's all these universes existing at the same time. There's a billion. The problem with that theory is it's completely untestable. It's like all theoretical math, and it's not really applicable. So that's actually fallen out of favor in the physics and cosmology community. What has now taken its place is this idea of sequential universe. So there's one universe at a time. Here we are. This is it. But prior to our universe, there was one before. After our universe, there'll be one after. And this concept of sequential universes points us to a material infinity. That is to say that the material nature of reality, the particles, the atoms, the molecules that make up the physical nature of reality as we experience it, is in fact infinite. And that's what brings us to this picture right here. What this represents is our experience of being in an infinitely material universe, or materially infinite. That is to say that if the material nature of reality is in fact infinite, then the only thing that ever is now. Here we are. The past is inaccessible. The future is always unknown. And we as observers perpetually inherit a moment. And that moment is, I would call it, I refer to in the book as the totality of the moment. That is to mean that all of us are here today sharing space, but outside of this room, the earth is moving, right? People are moving. The planet is moving. The cosmos is moving. All of these things are happening within a snapshot. And that moment, when I say a momentary totality, it can be any number. It can be, again, a picosecond, the small unit of measurement. It could be a year. It's not relevant to the number we give it. What matters is in whatever snapshot, the answer is always the same. It's this ever-present now. And in many ways, we recognize that if this is the nature of the universe, that has several kind of profound directions for both the organization of ourselves, our society, and our spirituality. I think over there. So one of the challenges, I think, with this is that human beings are systems thinkers, right? We observe processes, we observe patterns. The ideal is we take those patterns and we try to make them repeat over time. And then from there, we give it a kind of mechanistic view of the world. We see these patterns, we see them repeat, and it gives it kind of a mechanistic, it's like a machine. And one of the challenges of self-actualizing in the age of crisis is we've become extremely dogmatic about our creations. We've given our creations an almost naturalness, a necessity, right? The idea that, because it always happens, because it always observes it, we always observe it, that it must be static, it must be unchanging. But that's not true. We'd also argue that in that same kind of context, that, and this is the physicist Lee Smolin makes this argument, that our observations here from Earth, what we've done historically is we've projected them onto the universe. We've said, gravity works this way here, and everything we observe from here, follows a specific pattern of gravity, therefore it must be universal. The argument now is that we have to treat cosmology as a group of localized systems. So whatever we observe here makes sense here, and it's real. But it doesn't necessarily apply to the rest of the universe. Okay? And that notion, this is, again, this kind of notion of being here, being the observer as one of the momentary totality of the moment, is the nature of human orientation, is the nature of being as our hard sciences define it to be. Of course, our experience is a bit different. Now, before we get to, this is one thing I want to mention now. I want to emphasize from the start, we cannot measure another universe, right? That's not within our capacity. Given the scale of the universe, as you can probably imagine, we are so small, materially insignificant. I believe we're very significant, but materially insignificant in the scope of the universe. But our inability to measure doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of having to choose a direction. So let's make a counterpoint, right? Last time we talked about the crisis of doubt, desire, death, and dogmas, primarily the influence that the salvation narratives have had on our institutional structures. And I would argue that the salvation narratives have chosen for us. They chose nothing, a creator, and then something. They've imbued a hierarchy into the organization of the universe. Okay? What our hard sciences can tell us and continue to orient with is that that is not accurate. What is in fact accurate is that infinity is the default. Infinity is the default of nature. It is the default of, a great example, even like the mathematician Stephen Wolfram talks about how the laws of physics are the way they are because we are the way we are, and not the opposite, as has long been thought. The things that we observe in the universe, the fundamental nature of reality, is very specific to our unique kind of observational coordinates, right? The embodiment that we possess as human beings. So physics is the way it is because we are the way we are. Now I know this sounds like high level, but ultimately I would argue that this orientation with the infinite and recognizing as an observable infinity in the material nature of reality provides us with a profound context for reorganizing ourselves and society. First and foremost, we recognize that if the material nature of reality is in fact infinite, then we are both within that infinity, right, as fractional observers, but also of it. We possess an aspect of that, and I'll dive into a bit more about that in a bit. We also recognize that the dogmatic embrace of systems and static visions of governing society within specific institutions is inadequate. If nothing about the universe, has ever not been changing, why would we predicate society based on institutions that preserve the status quo, that attempt to reinforce the past onto the present? That is not an ideal way of organizing ourselves, because A, it's out of alignment with nature. B, it doesn't reflect, it's in very many ways, it is what has brought the crisis to our doorstep. So when we talk about the history of the universe, this is kind of the trajectory that it kind of gives us, and it gives us, again, an alternative to a hierarchical vision of divinity, which we're going to dive into in a bit. Next, I want to talk about the changing nature of time. So I make the argument that our experience as observers is essentially we are observers within an informational universe. That is to say that yes, we have these physical embodiments, but ultimately they are not us. We are more than them. And the universe is expanding exponentially in relation to the amount of information within it. So human data is expanding exponentially. In 2023, we produced over a zettabyte of data. A zettabyte, I believe, is a 1 with 21 zeros. So we constantly are producing more and more and more, and our reality keeps kind of shifting around that. And what it is doing is changing the way we experience time. Now, I would make the argument that in an infinitely material universe, where the only reality is an ever-present now, time is in fact the observing experience. We are time in many ways. So there's time, there's obviously time as measurements on a clock, but this is a kind of solar kind of contraption, an institution we've based on the Earth's rotation, in our calendars, etc. But the actual nature of reality is, as observers in the informational universe, we are the experience of being within a moment, and that totality of the moment. And that experience is not just localized within our embodiment, it is in fact all of it, right? We are indistinguishable from the circumstances we find ourselves in, because our capacity to act, our capacity to imagine, our capacity to build is always in relation to the circumstances we find ourselves within. So in that note, the way we perceive our individual moments is being shaped, is being transformed as we go through this technological and cultural ascendancy. Our imaginations are expanding. The very things that we've predicated the last 100 years of civil advancement on are breaking down in front of our eyes. And now we find this place where, the nature of reality is in fact something very different than what we thought it was. Now, this is easy and difficult to perceive. Let's start with the difficult part. Right? Difficult part is, again, we inherit a very linear perception of reality, and our institutions reinforce a linear perception of reality. They reinforce the idea that like you're going to work at a job for 40 or 50 years, you do this thing for some time, you're going to, I think this narrative is, I think it's apparent it's kind of broken down, but the American dream, right? You're going to work, you're going to build a house, a family, you're going to do these things. Economically, we know that's not a real reality for most millennials, certainly not for Gen Z in the immediate present, but this is what the institutions reinforce. Joseph Campbell, as a mythologist, writes about how the idea that all of human history is based on societies having individuals conform to a specific shape, right? Societies didn't want indivisible human beings, they wanted divisible human beings. If you were born to a hunter-gatherer society, if you were a certain character, you had to hunt, right? You had to get, that's what the community needed. What the changing nature of time represents is those barriers are actually breaking down, in that we are now entering an era where those limitations, those kind of specific shapes that we must take are no longer as relevant as they were in the past, but we don't have the institutions necessary to support them.
Why do you say they're breaking down? Why don't you just say they're changing? I mean, exponential has been around for a long time.
Sure.
And if you live 50 years, then the absolute change that takes place in 50 years for you is the same as it was for my grandfather.
No, I would disagree with that. I mean,
that's what exponential is. If it's a double growth, that's exactly what's taking place.
Yes, it's accurate that it's double growth. It's not accurate that it's the same thing, because if it's 50...
It is perceptually to me versus my grandfather.
Well, here's my counterpoint to that. Perceptually, I think perhaps to you and your grandfather that may have been accurate, but I'll speak to someone from the perspective of someone who's like on the emerging front of AI. Here's a great personal example. In the last 6 months, AI has really kind of taken off on a commercial product and a commercial level. So I've been a software developer for about 20 years. I started when I was like a kid. And just kind of like casually doing it. It's never been a full profession. In the last 6 months, AI has closed a gap for me that would have taken, I'm not exaggerating, about 6 years of direct training and kind of work towards. Where now with AI, I can do those things that would have taken me 6 additional years of just linear progress of studying, of just developing.
That's because you're comparing to linear.
No, but
if
I can do...
If you live in the world as it is, you recognize that it's changing exponentially. It's been changing exponentially forever.
Yes, but you said that it's the same, and my point is that the rate of change is... exponential growth obviously compounds, right? We understand that. So it cannot be the same, because at the end of the day, your grandfather, you can say, oh, it's the same as it is now. Your grandfather didn't have access to self-learning machines. I mean...
But the change to him was the same as it is to me. If it doubled for him, it doubled for me. Now, it doubled from a larger base.
Well, then it's not the same, though, right? If it doubled from a larger base, it's not the same.
I didn't say that, but the effect of the change was identical. It was doubling.
No, but again, how can you compare identical change to, let's say, so your grandfather, let's say, approximately 60, 70 years ago, to self-learning machines of the immediate present? I mean, the ultimate argument is like we can do more with our moments now than was ever possible in the past.
Right, but 35 years ago, our history, our understanding of the history of the universe was significantly different than it is now.
Yes.
And that change was no different than what happened prior to Einstein and a few years after 2007 or 1907.
It seems like you're saying that the change in its context of like just being change in its most isolated form, that change is not different. And I would agree, change happens all the time. Your initial question was, why am I saying it's breaking down? So let me just clarify that a bit. I'm saying it's breaking down because the systems are attempting to preserve themselves. They're not evolving. They are attempting to reinforce the past ways of thinking and being. And when I say systems, legal, economic, political, they are going away about the way they've done it for 250 years.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, so that's why I would say they're breaking down, because to your point, you're right that they're changing, but they are resisting that change, and therefore that's part of the structure. And when you talk about breaking down, like what is the consequence of that breaking down, right? The consequence of that is, for example, an ever-increasing wealth gap, right? An ever-increasing people...
that logic just flew right past me. I can't see that.
Okay, so when you have institutions that essentially, so what are all systems, right? What do systems do? They govern the relationships between people, whether two people or more. So they govern the way that all of us interact with ourselves, our law, our economics. Yeah.
I think that what we're talking about is confidence in the system is breaking down. It's the in other words, your grandfather was pretty confident things were going to be okay or whatever. Now we have less confidence in these institutions.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
But
That to
that's
me
because,
bridges the gap.
right, but in the time of my grandfather, he just worried about whether the mail got delivered.
Sure.
Today, we don't really worry about that, or some of them don't care.
Right, so we have less confidence in
But-
whatever.
But the nature that took place with my grandfather's time, there was just as many people trying to not change it as there is today, trying to keep things from being changed.
Right.
And there are just as many people trying to change in our time as there was with my grandfather's
Well,
time.
I'll show you an example, right? Let's go over a quick visual. I would say that your grandfather's time, is probably around this area, right? Right here on the curve. I would say we're probably a little closer to here now with our circle. So I'd say in the next 10 years, we're going to be here. So when you talk about the change of pace in an exponential world, right, an exponential change, this is what I'm talking about, where, yes, I agree with what you're saying, right? People have resisted change for some time. I agree with you're saying as was mentioned, right, the confidence in the systems is breaking down. I argue that it's breaking down because the results are not producing what they're intended to be. But my key differential is we can't say that this area of change is the same as this, because it's not in terms of our lived experience, it's not in terms of our technological ascendancy, it's not in terms of the cultural impacts of those things. I mean, there's so many aspects that go with change that, I mean, if they were the same, that would be more of a linear way of thinking. The change here is essentially equal to the change here. But that's not the case on an exponential curve.
That's, so what?
Okay?
But I think the change, like when cars were developed.
Sure.
The huge change then, but that change is not as big as what's happening with AI.
Well said, I would agree. I think there's nothing to compare, this is my key kind of argument. There is nothing to compare in the history of human civilization to self-learning machines. There's nothing. None of our innovations have been this powerful, none of them have been this impactful, and none of them will fundamentally reshape the nature of being.
We will only know that in the next feature, not now.
But my argument, but I just gave you the example to counteract that. I can do something now that I couldn't have done 6 months ago, and I can do it with essentially closing a 6-year skull gap. I built a medical software that I just launched 3 weeks ago in 2 months with my partner. She's also a developer. We would not have been able to do that without AI. No way.
That same statement could have been true 2 years ago or 10 years ago.
No, but it couldn't. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
In terms of being able to do something, getting them accomplished, we will create systems with AI that in a time period will become resistant to change itself and be replaced by new systems.
No, but I disagree that AI would be resistant to change. I think that the whole premise of AI, especially in the present open source kind of model community, which is is essentially, there's no moat with AI, right? I think if you think about past technologies, so for example, Microsoft had a moat. Everyone had to buy Windows. There was no competitor to Windows.
Right.
Today, the open source movement for AI is equally as powerful as OpenAI and the for-profit things. And I think that is, as a technologist, the most optimistic aspect of it for me is that many of us are working on these systems independent of a corporate model, because we don't want another Microsoft to control AI. That would probably be the most dystopian future, one of the most I could imagine in the context. But we'll get a little off track. I'm going to bring us back for a sec. I appreciate the feedback. I want to talk briefly in the kind of nature of the changing nature of time. 2 kind of examples that are really fascinating. So first is atomic clocks. Right? We were experimenting with atomic clocks. Atomic clocks are essentially rows of atoms where we can track we can use them as clocks to track moments. What's really fascinating about an atomic clock, it's the most accurate clock we can do. And it's something out of every 10 quintillion ticks. A quintillion is 1 with 18 zeros. So it would be 18 with 18 zeros, or 10 with 18 zeros. Only 3.5 are out of sync. So to kind of give you the scope of the accuracy of that clock. And what we've essentially learned from atomic clocks is that the nature of observation, the clock is only as accurate as the disorder it creates. And what happens is when we observe atomic clocks, when we view them, it creates entropy, it creates disorder. And the disorder that we create is minuscule, but what matters, and what I want to draw your attention to, is our capacity to create disorder through observation. The fact that our observation fundamentally changes the nature of the universe is a very real and repeatable phenomenon. And it's something that we understand to be accurate today. Here's another example. We're experimenting theoretically with like quantum time crystals. So a crystal or any object has a structural kind of component, right? A crystal is organized within a moment and you can see the entire structure. Time crystals are organized not only in space but also time. Here's the best example. So you can think about a time crystal like this. Imagine a snowflake that can go from one shape to another and can go back and forth. What matters about time crystals is they don't create entropy. So they can change without creating disorder. That opens the door for fundamental revelations in like quantum computing and things that are going to, again, that'll like fundamentally transform AI, it'll transform energy. Like these are all like huge breakthroughs that are changing, again, the nature of time in terms of how we relate to what we can do within our moments, how we experience the nature of reality, and our understanding of that experience. So now we get into the most provocative aspect of our conversation today, the single truth. Now, we talked about how time is changing the nature of reality, kind of demands a reorientation of the way we organize ourselves, our thought, to reduce the influence of the past onto the present. That is a larger goal of systemic actualization, self-actualization in the age of crisis, to kind of free ourselves from the constraints that we've inherited. In a materially infinite universe, where the only aspect of reality is now, change is in fact the single truth. Now we can break down truth, that word is two concepts, right? There's objective truth and subjective truth. Subjective truth is our lived experience. All of us have subjective truths. You have experienced things that are real to you, that are absolutely part of your identity, and shaped you, as have I, and those are real, and those are lived experiences, and those are important. That's the easy one. I think we all understand that our lives have been perpetually changing. There's nothing about our lives that remains static over time. Objective truth, this is kind of when we talk about the crisis of cosmology, this is what's recently been disrupted. Objective truth is the idea that I have an observation, I can measure that observation, I can share it with you, you can repeat that experiment, and we have then come to consensus around a shared observation. This is accurate, okay? It's accurate, I verify that. We now understand the fallacy that our observations are immune from change, that our observations are immutable. And this is where our scientific consensus is moving, is that, yes, we're now observing things, and we have to ground our daily life in some sort of accuracy, in some sort of shared agreement, but we don't kind of project them locally, universally. We kind of make sure that they're just primarily local observations. Change being the single truth represents the idea that there is a single universal commonality. Right? It's something that all individuals share, all of our efforts share, all of our observations share. So when we talk about spiritual renaissance and finding universal commonality, when we think about like historical religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, much of these make the argument that like love is that the universal kind of component, right? And that's the idea. Your intent is to spread love throughout the universe. I would say that, at least in the salvation narratives, it's kind of the line is blurred between love and altruism. I think those are two different things. But ultimately, I would argue that change is the orientation, the single commonality that we orient the reimagined spiritual project around, because it represents an orientation with infinity. And from that, it gives us the capacity to reimagine our interpersonal, our personal relationships with the world, as well as our systemic relationships with the world. We understand that in a materially infinite universe, humanity always crafts the past and the future in the present. It's not the other way around. It all happens now. Prophecy becomes more important than memory. This is the nature of reality, again, as our hard sciences are reaffirming it to us. This is what reality is. So the question is, how do we orient around it? Now, this relationship with the universe, and this is kind of gets into, I mentioned earlier, like how we're materially insignificant, but I think we're universally significant. There are some strange correlations between the universe and the human brain. What you're seeing at the top here, this is a map of the universe, a theoretical, calculated map of the universe as we can observe it from our coordinates. This in the bottom is a slice of a brain under a microscope, neural networks. The universe itself, mathematically, has more in common with the human brain than it does any individual galaxy. The same is true for the human brain. The human brain has more in common with the universe as a whole than it does with any individual neuron. We're starting to see these kind of correlations that overlap that help us identify the depth of our connection with the totality of experience. The idea that it is in fact inseparable. It is in fact a single thing happening. We observe from our unique conscious coordinates. In that note, the changing nature of time essentially calls us to exercise our most radical power, right? We want to become more than we are. And we want to build a society, build a structure, build institutions, build belief systems that empower the greatest amount of people to do that thing. This may seem abstract, but again, I want to emphasize, it's not. It's the material nature of reality. Although we don't experience it as such in our daily lives, we get caught in the flow of just doing something, we direct our focus energy towards a thing, we throw ourselves into it, we come up for air, we redirect ourselves. The material nature of the universe is ever-present change, and it provides us a consensus, it provides us a commonality to kind of base a spiritual project on that unifies the whole, but also helps us reorient ourselves and our systems. Kant, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, once asked what we would do when faced with absolute knowledge. Now I'll say, the single truth is subject to itself. It doesn't require believers. I'm not here to convince you to believe that the nature of the universe is infinite. But I would say that as far as human history goes, this is probably the greatest opportunity to make that decision now. If we understand that the material nature of reality is in fact infinite, that gives us a whole framework for re-understanding the nature of reality and how we orient ourselves with it. I think many of our, let's say, historical mythos, religions, cults, spirituality, have all tried to be able to kind of solve these great unknowns. Right? So many knows, we talked about the crisis of doubt, desire, and death. It was kind of core three. And of course, our dogmas around the three of them, our denial of them. In this case, the single truth gives us an aspect of orientation where, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are of the infinite universe. We embody it, we are part of it. If it is in fact an ever-present now, it's very much of us as we are of it. But we're also fractional. We recognize that each of us inhabits a unique set of conscious coordinates, right? A space that no one else can occupy. And that's real, and that's powerful. But ultimately, we would argue that that's an aspect of that infinity observing itself. Right? In the context of one of the questions about the Reimagined Spiritual Project, I'm going to talk about the Relational Universe in a bit, but one of the big questions is what about God? What about the concept of God? To that, my rebuttal is, what could be more godlike than infinity? Omnipresent, omnidirectional, omniscient. What could be more godlike than that? So let's talk about essentially the systemic implications of the single truth. So we've talked a lot about throughout, but ultimately, again, if we're going to orient with the infinite, we recognize that none of our systems deserve reverence. They don't deserve the power we've given them over us. All systems should be perpetually subject to challenge and change. That is the ideal organization in an exponential universe, orienting with infinity. And let's take a great example. Mathematics. Mathematics the question is mathematics natural? Did we discover mathematics or did we create it? Is it a tool? I would argue that it's a tool, and here's why. Mathematics is a phenomenal tool, right? It's shared observation. But mathematics does two things. It observes, which focuses on the past, or it predicts, it focuses on the future. One thing mathematics can never do is capture the immediate present. There's no mathematical formula that can capture now. If it was of nature, it would have the capacity to do that. We could also assume that our mathematics are essentially based on powers of 10. Unsurprising, right? 10 digits. So I think when we think about the nature of reality in our systems, our tools, we have to recognize that even our most sacred tools, even the best ones, are still tools, and we are more than that, and they can transform. If we want to get real sci-fi, we can imagine, I don't know if any of you follow the emerging disclosure, aliens, etc., that's kind of going on now, but we can imagine if there was another intelligent species, an extra-dimensional species, they may have a different form of mathematics, they may have a different form of calculating the universe that could be equally accurate to ours, but also disproven in many ways. It could be both at the same time. Because the conceptualizations of the universe can be very different. Again, if the laws of physics are the way they are because we are the way we are, it's not beyond the realm of thought that there could be alternative versions based on alternative states of being, alternative observers. A little far out, though. Now, let's move on. I want to talk about, so the single truth is not enough to base a spiritual project on. So to that end, we combine it with our oneness with the relational universe. Oneness with the relational universe represents the idea that there are no separate events in nature. It's a totality of transformation occurring within a moment. All of it exists in relation to the other. This is not new. Vedic philosophy, which is originated in what is now India, introduced the concept of the Atman and the Brahman, right? The Atman, the individual, the Brahman, the universal totality, and the inseparability of the two. Buddhism talks about padaka sampadaka, the idea of independent or dependent origination, the idea that all things spring out of other things, right? That there's no separation of the event chains. What it recognizes, again, is that each of us have an aspect of this infinity within us, an aspect of this divinity contained within us. And what is new, though, is that, again, our hard sciences are now beginning to reinforce this philosophy. Where in the past this was separate. Science said, no, there's a static vision of the world. We have these laws that are immutable, they don't change. We now understand that our observations continue to point us to infinity in our hardest sciences. And so that nature of infinity, that totality of the moment orients us. I make the argument that there are two observable infinities. This is how one of the grounding aspects of the spiritual project. There's the universe itself and human imagination. What is imagination? Right? Imagination is something that can only be defined by itself. It can only be defined by the individual experiencing it. It's infinite, and it is how we become more godlike. The objective is not to become God, but rather to become godlike, to embrace our humanity for what it is, and recognize that through our creation, through the alignment of the observable infinities within a moment, we express divinity, right? Our greatest power. We create the new. We bring things that have not existed into the universe. And that is the story of human civilization. All that we've ever done is aligning the universe with our intent, our imagination in a moment, and exercising that creative power. I would argue that in a relational universe governed by the single truth, any direction of focus and energy is an act of becoming. It is an active act of becoming. So when we think about the spiritual context, we develop, and we will develop this in depth in our next conversation about individual actualization, we develop practices, philosophies, and values to orient ourselves to most take advantage of the alignment of the observable infinities. It also recognizes that, in many ways, if we recognize the other as equally divine as ourselves, which this does, right? If you contain an aspect of infinity, as I do in that imagination, if each of you contains an aspect of that divinity, it also creates a restlessness with you. Which is why, in the beginning I mentioned, the reimagined spiritual project is binding systemic reformation to spiritual renaissance. Because if you genuinely embrace the divinity of the other, it creates a restlessness in you. How can the systems be so unjust and immoral and exclusive for so many people in the world today? You know, I think many of us have the extreme fortune. We'll kind of get into birth lottery. I don't want to get ahead of myself in a bit, but we're obviously very fortunate to be here for a variety of reasons. But there's many people who, you know, our systems have kind of trapped an immense amount of latent imagination in the world. And the entire concept of transcending the crisis is how do we free that latent imagination? How do we free the individuals so more people can express the observable infinities, can align them within a moment more often? It's essentially a death of material reductionism, which is the hard sciences of the past. I think when you think about the relational universe, the philosopher Alan Watts talks about the universe being a democracy. And I think that's a really great example. He talks about how if we can imagine, and I don't have an image, I apologize, but you can imagine a space and playing, you imagine a ball. If there's one ball floating, and I say to you it's moving, well, you can't tell if it's moving. It's just a ball. If there's two balls, you can tell that one ball is moving, but what happens is whatever one you look at is the one that starts to move. Three balls, the democratic aspect, that's when you know when something is moving. That's the relational universe. With three balls, you can tell which ball is moving away from the other two. So when we talk about the interconnectivity of our experience, we understand that a relational universe is, again, not only our perception of the world, but it's also the material nature of reality. It is the way the universe is. And some things, especially in the context of the universe, I think one of the challenges with being human is we often confuse the idea that, we confuse our desire to make sense of the world with the idea that everything we observe must make sense. And that's not accurate. I think one of the challenges that prevents us from orienting around infinity, like we talked about in the crisis of productivity and participation, is we've organized society around what I call zero-sum games. A zero-sum game is that there are winners and there are losers. When you organize society around zero-sum games, you attach personal value to it. You attach your embodied value. Your ego attaches to that thing, right? All of us have done these things. And it's never enough. Like it furthers this crisis of doubt and desire, right? I've done these things, but I don't, speaking of personal, I've done all these cool things in my life, but I don't own a house. So am I enough, right? Am I there yet? Have I reached that thing? And that's part of the challenge with organized society around zero-sum games is A, doesn't orient, it's not aligned with an infinite nature, right? Because there's an infinite abundance. That abundance is trapped. It's trapped today within systems of our own making. The question is, how do we release that abundance into the world? And that's ultimately where we're going to go. I'll hit on one other point that kind of reinforces this in terms of our hard sciences, is the field of quantum physics, right? So to keep it very high level, quantum physicists believe that the root nature of reality is in fact a field of probability. So it's not, you can't actually measure it. It's not a thing you can measure. What happens is the moment you look at it, it collapses upon itself and a reality springs forth. But what's really important is that we understand that by trying to make the future an object, so what I mean by that is by trying to bring a very specific future into the present, you observe an experiment and you bring it into it, you change the trajectory. Right? In an infinitely material universe, oriented in infinity, in many ways it happens kind of to us. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to make it an object, right? I think there's many things that we do want to do just for our sanity. But we understand that, again, our observation, our influence changes the trajectory of the universe. There's a direct correlation in that. Okay, so at its most base level, that is the nature of reality. Finally, I want to talk about what does this mean for self-actualization? So, in a relational universe governed by the single truth, I argue that we must redefine self. We have to reconceptualize ourself to be more accurately defined as the relationship between an individual and their circumstance within a given moment. Therefore, we break down self-actualization into individual actualization, which is the development of I, and systemic actualization, the development of we. And together they form the whole self of self-actualization. And this orientation of the individual and the relationship between their circumstances gives us the interpersonal and structural framework for reimagining society towards an alternative. Next, we'll talk about birth lottery and event chains. Birth lottery and event chains represent the unique circumstances that we all inhabit, right? So all of us have no say in who we were born to, where we were born, who our parents were, right? We have no say and no control of that. And all children, as a father of a 3.5-year-old, I imagine some of you may be parents as well, are extremely vulnerable, right? They share in that extreme vulnerability, where the world just happens to them for much of their development life. The challenge today is that the systems surrounding us prioritize birth lottery as the most important event in our life. So statistically, we understand today that if you're born in abject poverty, you will remain in abject poverty your entire life. Now, of course, there are outliers. It's not to say that you cannot transcend that, because we are both the sum of our circumstances, but what makes us human is that we're more, right? We're more than the sum of our circumstance when we have the capacity and access and agency to act upon that. But the challenge is, again, all of our institutions prioritize birth lottery. We've organized society around the idea of luck. And it begs the question, right? If all of our institutions, and so let me give you an example before I get into luck and divinity, how do we organize? So for example, the most direct form of transfer of wealth is through what we call dynastic wealth. The idea that I inherit money from my parents, right? That's dynastic wealth, and that's how fortunes are passed down. So it solidifies systems of class and caste, right? That's the whole point of dynastic wealth. Even the institution of marriage was developed to transfer property rights, right? That's why marriage became a thing. It's why, like, perennial lineage. We know that, for example, in hunter-gatherer societies, they were a polyamorous society. The children were everyone's children, right? There was no lineage. There was nothing to hand down when you were nomadic. You were constantly traveling. So it was like, it takes a village was a very literal statement in that concept. But once we started settling down, once we developed surplus, the institution of marriage was designed to preserve dynastic wealth. The challenge with that, again, is it reinforces birth lottery. If I'm born into this circumstance where my parents don't have access to an agency in the world, I am likely not to have access to an agency. And say, with the US, for example, right? Education is based on municipality taxes. So it really matters where you live and where you're born into. You will have less access to less resources, less opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge, of course, in orienting with a relational universe governed by the single truth is to transfer that to societal wealth, right? To have a system of wealth where your access to an agency in the world is not predetermined by your birth lot, right? Or at least, let's say this, at least the capacity to diminish the effect on your access to an agency as much as possible. Because we can't, I don't think it's being realistic, and it's the argument is not for like a nanny state, right? It's not that like parents don't have a role and don't have an importance. There's always going to be the influence of the parent. But we do want to create a society where we recognize every child is essentially like a tongue-tied prophet, right? They have all this imagination, all this visualization of the world, but they're trapped, right? Trapped in a specific kind of place that they've been born into. So we want to reduce the impact of their birth lottery on their access to opportunity, on their access to exercise their agency in the world. Again, I want to emphasize, it's not about, nothing I talk about is about equality of outcomes. I want to emphasize that. That's not only is it not feasible, but it's not ideal, right? You're never going to close the gap between a novice and a master. That's not going to happen, and we don't want that to happen. We want people to dedicate prolonged focus and energy towards becoming a master in a specific category, right? That's how we develop specialization. But we do want to create a society where you are born does not put you in a perpetual state of lacking access to agency. Again, that's why when I talk about trapped imagination, that's what I mean. Because that's a policy choice, right? And we can think about this in the context of, let's think about like the context of karma. Right? We've all heard about karma. Now there's kind of two ways to think about karma. There's the way that's very real, which is in a relational universe governed by the single truth, you are it. So if you put out, for lack of a better term, great vibes, you put out good feeling, you put out great efforts to help others, that's going to return to you. I believe that's very accurate. Here's what I don't believe is accurate. Historically, there's been the idea of karmic rebirth, right? Let's say, for example, the Hindu caste system. Now, the caste system, we have to conceptualize, the caste system is not, and was not a materialistic caste system as we presently understood it until the British invaded, until they conquered. The caste system was a very holistic system in India. It wasn't always like a true materialistic kind of difference. But the idea is the caste system was a spiritual technology developed for a time, right? Let's say 2,000 years ago, you're a sustenance farmer in India, and you're born to this sustenance farm. There's no social mobility. It's not a thing, right? It was the princely states. There was no opportunity. So it was a way of conceptualizing the world that kind of gave you peace that your actions today would contribute to something better beyond. Today we recognize if we believe in karmic rebirth, and we can even go beyond Hindus. I've had Christians make this argument to me that someone is born impoverished because God wanted them to be, because they transgressed in their past life. If we believe that, which I argue we have to reject, then that's a false claim, because then we make ourselves God. Because today the material conditions of the people in the world are systemic. That's a choice, right? It's global organization. It's policy and structure choice. That someone born into abject poverty doesn't have access to food, right, as an example, or healthy food. So I think when we conceptualize birth lottery and event chains obviously being the history we inherit, so I think there's kind of two components of that, right? Obviously our choices. In a relational universe governed by the single truth, we can view it almost like as tree branches, if you will, right? Every choice you make branches you in a specific direction. But the problem with that is it leaves many directions behind, right? And over time, that kind of compounds, and here we are. And but there's also the event chains that kind of happen to us. I think it's an illusion to imagine that like we are solely responsible for the kind of direction of our personal lives. Much of the universe happens to us. Much of the things are out of our control, and we're kind of subjected to these things, whether it be the time and space we occupy, whether it be the policies those in power make, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you've heard me say before, but the whole conceptualization behind spiritual renaissance is to free our concept of reality to lessen the influence of the past onto the present, so as to maximize our powers within the immediate present, to maximize our powers to align the observable infinities and create, to become more godlike. Let's see, talk about that. All right, ultimately, I'll conclude with this, and then, so ultimately, like the choice of orienting ourselves and aligning ourselves with the relational universe governed by this single truth is to reject randomness. To reject randomness on the way we organize ourselves, our lives, etc. And I mentioned before the concept of luck and divinity. Dynastic wealth really blurs that line. Right? The idea is, are luck and divinity the same thing? Because if they are, right, if luck and divinity are equal, then we would say that the billionaire class, the systems of class and caste we inhabit, which I argue will never be free within, we could say they are justified, right? If luck is the same thing as divinity, then you're justifiable. You have all that wealth, and that's God's will that you have all that wealth, so to speak, right? The opposite, if we go the opposite, then obviously you say, well, this is a poor way to organize society. This is certainly the way I'm leaning, right? The bias that I'm coming to you with is that is a poor way to organize society. I forget who said the quote, but it was something along the lines of like, I'm more worried about all the Einsteins who never had an opportunity to be because they were born into certain circumstances, right? How much genius is left latent in the world because of just birth lottery. And of course, the third component is that they could be both the same and not, right? The idea being that, again, today we choose to make luck and divinity the same thing through our systemic process. We choose to make your birth lottery directly correlate to your capacity to express and align the observable infinities of the moment because of the resources, the access, the agency you are given throughout that journey, as opposed to a different orientation which would more greatly empower the individual. So on that note, that wraps it up. Let's open it up for discussions, questions, comments, critiques. Let's dive in. Yes?
Same thing as last time. I don't understand, first of all, I don't understand the argument, the basis of the crisis. To me, there isn't a crisis of the scale you're trying to describe.
Mm-hmm.
We have crises, there's no question about that. But this is not some kind of long-term, that somehow the crisis that exists today is somehow different than the crisis that existed with our grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
or his grandfather. And the other thing is that infinity itself isn't a particularly troublesome concept. To me, exponential growth that exists at point 0 on a curve is the same thing that exists at one point below infinity.
Mm.
And if you exist at infinity and take the first derivative, it's the same slope that exists at point 2 you take the first derivative. So to me, exponential growth is a natural thing that takes place and has nothing more evil to it or bad about it. It's just the reality of what it takes place. We grow exponentially because that makes sense, where linear growth does not make sense. And at any one point on an exponential curve, when you look at that particular point, all you see is linear growth. But you go one step further, and guess what? That slope changes.
Yeah,
So it's nothing weird about it. And likewise, nothing weird about infinity, because it's just one different place. At infinity, you won't notice any difference than you did 20 years before that.
So I'm a little confused. Help me understand. I don't think I've made the argument that exponential growth is weird. I don't think
I got the impression that you believe it is part of the crisis, and that
No.
the evil is linear growth.
No. So I want to be clear. Today had nothing to do with the crises. I mean, I kind of referenced it a bit. And your first point about us, I mean, we've kind of already gone through that a bit, so I don't really have much more to say. I disagree that the idea that at the end of the day, like if you're saying the crisis is the same, I think it discounts like lived experience. It discounts the immediate present, because obviously self-learning machines are not the same as like a car, right? So that's obvious, but that's fine. Like we can, I understand.
I disagree with that.
Okay, I mean that's fine. I'm not sure what I can say to convince you, and that's okay. But yeah, to the point about exponential growth, I'm not. If I gave the impression that I thought it was weird or evil or anything negative, that wasn't the case. I was just trying to highlight that we are now, your point about like, okay, the negative slope of infinity minus one, that's fine. But again, we have to conceptualize the immediate present for what it is and how we inherit it. So we recognize ourselves on this slope, kind of at the knee of the curve, right, looking up. So I think that at the end of the day, if that's where we recognize ourselves in the immediate present, we know that in the next decade, for example, that transformation is going to be insane, right? The next 50 years, right? So I'm not, again, I don't know where the disagreement is stemming from, because I didn't make the claim that exponential growth is weird or evil or anything like that. It just is.
Well, we can agree on that. And then the other question, we always end up with this endpoint here, is that the world is, in terms of your statement that if you're born of abject poverty, you're stuck in abject poverty. But over time, that's not true. And we have changed the notion of how much of the world is stuck in a point of abject poverty. Poverty is we have reduced the level of poverty in the world significantly in the last 100 years.
I agree, but that doesn't contradict what I said. Changing the level of poverty, because I agree statistically poverty has gone down, it doesn't change the fact that if you're born in abject poverty today, like that's multi-generational poverty, you will remain there. Like that's statistically accurate. So you can say, I'm not disagreeing that poverty is reduced. What I am saying is that poverty, which is a policy choice, is a detriment to the development of the individual. Statistically, we know that to be accurate, right? Like we know that.
Sure. If I was born poorer than I was, I'd probably be a lot different than I am now.
Sure. Yeah.
But so what?
But so what is like I reject so what. I mean the idea is like we have to why, if we understand that there's this reality. I think your central argument last week and this week, as you mentioned earlier, is you don't. It's almost like, it seems to me, and again, if this is not a correct statement, just correct me, but it seems to me that you're saying that we've always had crises, we've always had problems, and then so what? And the argument is that we now exist, my counter argument is that we've never had the capacity to reorient ourselves in terms of the technological prowess, the collective networking, right? We've never had the moment that we have in the immediate present. This is all of universal history has led up to this moment. This is it, right? The entire history of the universe leads to here.
No.
Yes. How can you deny that? Where's the future?
Well, for tomorrow.
Yeah, but tomorrow is unknown. Here,
Of course.
this is real. This is what's led up to.
If we asked that same question 10 years ago, we'd come with the same answer.
Of course, because that's the nature of infinity. That's the momentary totality. That is the orientation of being in a materially infinite universe. It only ever is now. The difference is the scope of now, the changing nature of time. We can do more now with our moments than ever before. Think about it this way. 20 years ago, think about text messages and cell phones. 20 years ago, we didn't have smartphones.
Right.
Right? The speed of communication has dramatically increased in the last 20 years. Think about 200 years ago.
But that's what I mean
That's
earlier.
good.
Is that the change that takes place now is the same in percentage terms as it was 10 years ago.
But logically, how is that accurate when you have a global population connected through instant communication today, where 200 years ago you didn't? How is that logically accurate that the pace of change is the same?
To me, well, from the standpoint of the percentage change that took place 10 years ago is the same as the percentage change that's taking place now.
But is
That's
that
the
like,
nature of exponential growth.
but again, yes, the nature of exponential growth is doubling, right? I understand what you're saying.
What does it be double? It can be 1.2 times, 2.6 times. Whatever that change is.
But I think
this uniform exponential growth is going to be the same for any time period you look at.
But you're abstracting the rate of change as opposed to the impact of change in the reality of the moment. Like it's obviously not the same today as it was 200 years ago.
That's wonderful.
Well, but I'm trying to say that our perception of that change, if we could put ourselves back 200 years ago, we would still have the same perception of change.
But so that's why I gave that AI example, like as someone who's at the forefront of that technology. I disagree with that statement. I think it's very obvious today that change is happening exponentially in these fields.
So it's not a uniform exponential change. You're telling me now that the rate of change of the curve has gotten steeper.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's no longer double.
I don't think we have an actual calculation of the rate of change, but yeah.
Well, but that's what you're arguing, that that's what it is.
No, I'm arguing that it's growing exponentially, yeah. So we can, it doesn't, if it's 2.5 or et cetera, I mean, not only is, what we understand is not only is the rate of change changing, right, but that, to your point, the increment of change is changing. Kurzweil made this argument in his book. So yeah, and I agree with that statement, but again, let's pause for a moment because we had some other questions, and you and I think, could go back and forth for the next, yeah, you said Robbers?
I have a question about choices. In other words, if what we're looking at is the fact that each individual needs to have a choice and if that choice changes the impact of the birth lottery in ways that make our society work better, even though we know that the present systems are not functioning to that goal. How can we apply ideas of self-actualization so that we can apply that to systems, not just to the individual?
I love it. So that will be, I mean, there's many ways, and this is our next two conversations. So next conversation will be like...
That's what I'm looking for in this course.
Yes, well then, I appreciate you sticking it out, and the good stuff is coming next week. So next week we're going to talk about individual actualization, and we're going to talk about, for example, frameworks of core values we can embody to better orient us with the infinite nature of reality. We're going to talk about the idea of cooperation as a base, and how that is cooperative work, cooperative individuality, cooperative play, etc. Like reframing the nature of kind of how we orient ourselves. We'll talk about being an authentic imposter, like how, what is it like to actually be in this momentary totality. So we'll talk about that, and in the fourth course, we'll take those core values and what we develop, and we'll say, okay, if we truly embody these core values, how do they shape the systems that we surround ourselves with? And then we'll do a deep structural analysis of kind of how we could do that. Economics, law, and politics as the three kind of core focuses.
That's where I have difficulty relating self-actualization to systems.
Yes. So I would bring us back to that point where I would argue that in a relational universe governed by the single truth, we define self as the relationship between individual and their circumstances within a moment. And that's where the systemic justification comes from in terms of our spiritual project, is that we recognize that the individual's capacity to act is always in relation to the system surrounding them. Their capacity to imagine, right? So until we create for lack of a better term, a higher floor for the collective to kind of stand on, there's going to be an immense amount of imagination that just kind of falls through the cracks. And the question is, like, if we have, you would imagine that, like, it's a small percentage, maybe like certainly less than half of the global population that can participate in, like, let's say the most advanced forms of work today, imaginative, kind of creative work. What does that look like when we have 80% of the population doing that, right? What does it look like when we automate most of the repetitive jobs, which is the ideal, but more importantly, have the systems in place where individuals can reorient the trajectory of their life? So I did something that was automated, but I have the social infrastructure where I'm not going to lose my house, I'm not going to, my kids are going to starve, I'm not going to not have medical insurance, where I can focus on learning a new direction and then apply myself that way. So, many of that is, today was more of the grounding of like, okay, next week we're going to talk about core values and like what that means, but the grounding of orienting with infinity, because that gives us the justification. Again, we're choosing in this alternative to orient with nature as it is, as opposed to what our inherited dogmas prefer it to be. Yeah, so next week?
Well, we're just all competing for that. And when the system to preserve those present systems continues, that competition becomes stuck.
Yeah, it's zero-sum games. It's just like there's got to be winners and losers, and ultimately, like, there'll always be winners and losers, but we can define what losing means. Right? Like, in fact, I would argue that as we get into the systemic component, the alternative I'll present is going to be more competitive than the present alternative, than what we have today. But the fact is it's more competitive because the price of failure is not so high. Right? I think about, like, I had in my early 20s, I founded an e-commerce business, like a beer brewing business, actually. I'm technically a master brewer. And I sold like beer stuff to make your beer and wine all over the country. But like, I was like 5 years into that business before I made any money. Like, I was like dirt poor, and if I had failed, I would have been like 30 with like $0. And I mean that in the most, like, I was like living with my mom. Like, it was not an easy place. So the price of experimentalism, the price for trying something new, is very high under our current institutions. And that is antithetical to an experimentalist culture. My argument is that, like, this technological ascendancy, we want to encourage experimentalism as like the highest form of work. Because that's what, you know, in a universe of perpetual change, that is the ideal. How do we evolve as quickly as possible and as many directions as possible, right? And give people the freedom to do that, so they can do that without fear of destitution, essentially. Well, I'm working for it, so hope I have your support.
I don't think so.
I'm not sure that's a worthwhile goal.
No, fair enough. You have your goals, I have mine.
No, but you can have that goal, but reality won't really provide that.
Well, I think you and I have experienced very different realities to date.
Yeah, I have had a few more than you have.
You certainly have, yeah. Without a doubt. Any other questions, guys? Well, thank you all so much. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.